So yesterday I finished replaying Assassin's Creed Syndicate again, a phrase I never thought that I'd say, but it's a game my thoughts have changed on a lot. It's a game I was incredibly hyped for, and like every AC game as of 2015, I genuinely liked it the first time through. Then in the months to come I soured on it a fair bit, and soon enough it became the game that had killed AC, at least before Origins came. But in the last year and a half I haven't really had the same disdain. I never fully came round to the game again, but after the absolute abomination we got in 2018, I thought it was just okay. Not terrible, but an incredibly mediocre experience, especially in comparison to the games we got before and after it. And so after almost half a decade of Syndicate existing, which is crazy to think about, I thought I'd revisit the game and give it my honest opinion all these years later and see if it's still as bad as I thought. So the game starts off with us being reintroduced to Bishop and her style of modern day, and before we've even been given the chance to play the game, Syndicate is off on the completely wrong foot, giving us what might be the worst modern day as of Syndicate's release, maybe besides Unity, and the modern day in the game shows up 3 times and makes up for a grand total of 10 minutes of cutscenes. And it's not just that it's short, even the best modern days in the series are relatively short in comparison to the Ancestor story. It's that it's not playable, it's not interesting, it has no connection to the overall series, and generally is treated like a side note, which it never should be. It's like Quebec made the game, then the week before release remembered it was an Assassin's Creed game, so just chucked in a few cutscenes. It doesn't feel like it wants to be there, it doesn't need to be there, but it's just there because it's an Assassin's Creed thing. It's like most modern days after 3, it's incredibly inconsequential, and I'm not going to bring it up again because it's really not important to the game, and there isn't much to say about it, and that really spells out the issue right there. Anyway, the game then properly begins, and we're introduced to Jacob and Evie Fry, our 2 protagonists in Syndicate, a first for the series, and 5 years later, my question about this still remains, why? I remember during the months building up to the game, people said this was a choice done by Ubisoft Quebec, the lead studio on the game, because of GTA 5's success, and that it would work with AC because it worked with GTA 5. But in that game, the protagonists actually matter. They each have a unique ability that actually makes something of a difference, and you can switch between them in missions either because you have to or for certain gameplay advantages, and that isn't present here. The game was marketed as if Evie was the stealthy way to go, and if you wanted to remain a blade in the crowd, play as her, and that Jacob was more combat oriented, and if you just wanted to fight, then he was the way to go. But the thing is, they play completely the same, with the same weapons, counters, assassinations, with the main difference being in the skill tree, Evie can become invisible at a point, which, you know, absolutely outstanding move for a game with such an emphasis on stealth that completely fits in. But anyway, I'll get into the skill tree properly in a bit. What I'm trying to say is there's no point having 2 protagonists, and it actually hurts the game, which I'll get into in a second. The actual characters themselves are very different. Evie is a character who's dedicated to the Order, one who devotes herself to the Creed and her father's ideals. She has a lot of ambition and interest when it comes to their work, but isn't entirely deadpan. Jacob, on the other hand, is the big funny man who makes epic jokes, but he also has a heart of gold. Aww. I'll be honest, I'm not particularly a fan of either of these. Jacob has 0 depth whatsoever, and his one personality trait is he makes jokes. And the thing is, it doesn't really work when he's not very funny. I always compare him to a child entertainer, as he makes these very bland dad jokes that are very sort of tame, which even if they're not meant to be funny, it's not an excuse for poor writing, or a lack of writing for that matter. We've had humorous assassins in the past, but they've had depth and other traits, and that humour comes out when necessary, instead of taking you out of what presumably are meant to be serious moments, as Jacob does. Evie, on the other hand, is better than Jacob, but still not good. She's not really like any of the other assassins, but still comes off as very stale, and a big part of that is in her character progression, which is non-existent. Neither of these characters change or grow, nor is there any sense of moral conflict or personal issues. They're just constant, and as a result of that, on top of the other issues, I had no connection to either protagonist. In regards to the actual narrative of the game, an outline would be that Evie and Jacob are working on smaller missions outside of London, and they get tired of feeling inconsequential, and so they take on London, a city that's been overrun by Templars, using a gang called the Blighters, and so they go there to take down the Templar leader in London, Crawford Starrick, as well as all of his underlings, while also stopping him from obtaining one of the Shrouds of Eden, which can heal any wound and enhance your strength, as well as a few other things in the extended media, but that enhanced strength and unlimited healing are the two main ones in Syndicate. The story is very forgettable. I started writing this script not long after replaying the game, and I already feel as if I have Syndicate-induced Alzheimer's, because every character and plot thread is incredibly bland and also very repetitive. There's an assassination about 2/3 of the way through the game that pretty much sums up the entirety of the story, as well as Jacob and Evie's relationship. Basically, Jacob finds out the governor of the Bank of England is planning to help Starrick rob the bank, and Jacob doesn't like that. So he goes to Frederick Aberline, the chief inspector of the London Met, and he goes, "Oh, the governor of the Bank of England is setting up an inside job, so I was thinking I'd sort of go to the Bank of England and kill the governor of the Bank of England inside the Bank of England." And then the chief inspector of the London Metropolitan Police goes, "Oh yeah, go on pal, it's an excellent idea, I'll even give you a hand, if you like." And then, you know, so he does that, which is a great idea to start, and the next day Evie goes to him, "Oh, Jacob, mate, you've almost collapsed the British economy by murdering the governor of the Bank of England inside the Bank of England." "Oh man, that's bad, but I was just sort of thinking I'd become mates with the bloke running the enemy gang with the workhouses, and that he might like try and blow up some kids in one maybe. I think there's some good banter to be out there." And then Evie goes, "Oh, I can't stay mad at you. Go on, get out of here, you little scamp, before I change my mind." Oh. And this same thing happens again and again, so many times throughout the story, and that should be where you put in character development or growth so it feels realistic and you feel something of a connection, but they do nothing with it, and as a result the whole story just sort of meshes together, with the only thing really separating different story beats being the assassination missions, which, come to think of it, all but one of these are done by Jacob, and surely the big stealth protagonist should be doing these very unique and stealth-defined missions, but at the end of the day, it's just another reason why we shouldn't have had two protagonists in the game. I feel Jacob had nothing to him, but I feel Evie was somewhat interesting, and on her own, she could have gone from very mediocre to at least decent, but she can't do that when the two are tethered together, and the bulk of the missions belong to Jacob. Sequence 8, I think it is just 4 missions with Jacob alone, and you'd forget Evie even existed. And so instead of the two working off each other, they kind of hold each other back, resulting in one of the most drab and forgettable narratives in all of Assassin's Creed. So now I've spoken a little about the story of the game, I thought I'd talk about the second most important thing, the gameplay, and again, it isn't very good. First of all, the combat in this game is my least favourite in the entire series. Syndicate's combat comes right after Unity's, which I genuinely quite liked. While it isn't my ideal AC combat, it works well, and in theory especially, is very good. Syndicate is the polar opposite. Instead of timing a strike and dodging and getting used to a weapon, you just sort of mash X as you sort of tickle the enemy to death. I can't see what's happening here. It's an interpretive dance for all I know. Basically, this combat has no weight whatsoever, but it's not a Brotherhood kind of thing where that's balanced with having a lot of power. It feels like you have none, so you'll get these Looney Tunes animations of you stabbing a man 10 times and you haven't made a dent, and Jesus Christ, does this get tedious. You're given an option of 3 types of weapons, no swords, but knuckle dusters, cookery knives and canes, and there's no difference. They offer a few different animations but play completely the same, and no matter which you choose, things get very dull very quickly. Another thing that does bother me about weapons, clothes, gear, anything like that, is you buy it in a menu as opposed to in a store. Menus should be reserved for things like your brightness instead of buying your actual gear. It made me appreciate travelling the city you were in older games to find a tailor or a blacksmith, but this is just quite lazy. The time spent in a menu in a game should be minimal, and although this seems like a small thing, it's something that takes you out of the world when it could encourage you to explore it, even to a small extent. Anyway, combat is just one of a few pillars of AC, so what about the stealth? Well, the stealth's actually not even that bad. Just like in Unity, you have that mechanic where if a guard loses sight of you, they'll look in that place, which I do like. There are definitely some issues though. Sometimes you'll whistle and the man 5 feet in front of you won't hear, but a guard from over the road will. Also, throwing knives aren't always instant kills with headshots when they really should be. The point of stealth is that you have this incredible strength until you're seen, and that's where the tension is, that if you're found, it could well be your death, and that's why we should have a certain amount of power. Things like Hidden Blade insta-kills, for example, should never have left with Origins, and I feel the same with headshots, with throwing knives, or at the very least just body shots, as they are your only silent throwable weapon, and I think the stealth would be better if that was the case. The stealth, of course, is at the forefront in the black box assassination missions, which are when the game really is at its best. It's nice to sort of work your way through an assassination and get these unique kills, and if Origins wasn't the shift in the paradigm that it was, I would have liked to see where these had gone from the last two games. It would have been cool if we didn't have these giant icons and prompts telling us before we'd started where all the opportunities were, or maybe if it was possible to do some small optional missions beforehand to maybe lower security or open up some more opportunities. But as they stand, they're quite decent, and what most people would agree is when Syndicate is at its best. My next issue in regards to stealth is one I touched upon earlier, being the invisibility. This is a skill you can unlock as Eevee, and it makes no sense. I'm sure the explanation is something to do with how the Animus just reflects Eevee's incredible stealth abilities, but if it can just make Eevee invisible, what can't it do? Why can't it then just remove all the enemies in your way, or make you invincible? It's an issue that I have with the newer anime, that they can just explain anything and there's no rules that are established. It's either totally fucked, or has the ability to do anything, depending what suits the game at that minute. And it makes things far less tight than when things used to be a case of just reliving the life of your ancestor, where things are set in stone, as opposed to straight up giving you superpowers. And I mean, superpowers and godlike abilities in AC without a piece of Eden? Not only is that completely ludicrous and also prone to break law, but also it will probably break any sense of groundedness or rules. What a bizarre alternate reality that would be. Anyway, in terms of the other side of the Animus coin, we see the Helix Rifts as like an Animus glitch, and this one takes you to World War I, because as Syndicate made very clear, Quebec were completely bored of making Assassin's Creed games before they even started. And a lot of people like to quote this as the reason Assassin's Creed would work in a World War setting. And I mean, no, it doesn't, nor does this really prove that, like, at all. You've got these soldiers attacking you with batons when they have rifles and revolvers, which does seem quite stupid, and you really couldn't hold that disbelief for an entire game, so it kind of takes AC combat off the table, and even if it is stealth oriented, you can't really avoid the guns. And tell me, how many World War shooters have you played? How many can you name? Tons. Now, you can't really say the same about games set in ancient Egypt, or the American Revolution, or the Renaissance. You just can't do it. Not only does it take away from what Assassin's Creed is, but it also takes away from its uniqueness, and it's something tons of other game series have done before, far better than Ubisoft will be able to do. People kind of have this idea of Assassin's Creed's cool, this is a cool setting, surely the two will work together, and they really don't. Like, the whole thing ends shortly after a set piece that is ripped right out of Battlefield or COD, and to be honest with you, this isn't why I play Assassin's Creed, and this Rift has very little of that, and whatever it's trying to prove, it fails miserably when it makes me desperately want to go back as playing Jacob Fry and his gang called the Rooks. I have kind of avoided talking about it, but you can have a gang in the game and have them help you out in combat situations, and it is about as silly as it sounds, but it isn't very out of place in a game like Syndicate, where very little of it is taken seriously. It's not really in depth or fun to use, but it's just sort of there more because it makes sense in regards to the story, and this makes me wonder why they didn't just try and make Assassin Recruits again on current gen. Not only is it a feature that fans love, but it actually makes sense with the series instead of trying to start a London street gang. But anyway, now that we've established the gameplay so far hasn't been very good, let's talk about the traversal, which is kind of worse than the combat purely because it's sort of a flat out insult to the series. London in 1868 had fairly spread out buildings, which means more often than not you can't jump from roof to roof or generally traverse with parkour, and it's at that point, at whatever meeting took place at Ubisoft, someone should have said, right, this doesn't work for Assassin's Creed, which is presumably when someone else goes, oh, doesn't it? We should just make it so you press LB or something and that just does the distance for you. And what we get from that is the rope launcher, which is effectively a grappling hook with a little zipline feature, and this should not exist in an Assassin's Creed game. Running across rooftops from building to building was great. It was a place with no citizens and one that was quicker to traverse. It was basically your own domain, but with that came having to figure out how you get up or down, and also there was guards who'd kill you if they saw you up there. There was this element of danger in exchange for speed, and it was this great system utterly unique to Assassin's Creed that cannot be implemented due to the game's setting and is replaced with something with no depth at all. I've seen people say, oh well, it's convenient, and sure it is given the setting, but that doesn't excuse removing any depth or fun from the game's traversal, which is a key pillar from the series. If there is a setting where it's more convenient to not do parkour, it shouldn't be included in an Assassin's Creed game. Also, there's carriages in the game, and sure, they do their job, but it's not what traversal should be, and on the whole, traversing London isn't fun at all, which takes us on to the city itself. You probably expect me to say now how much I dislike London, as most things I've said so far have been negative, but it's not even that bad. London doesn't interest me on the whole. I think it's quite an oversaturated city in media, especially if you consume a lot of TV and film from the UK, but it's not like New York where you see it a lot and it still seems really cool. It just seems a bit dull to me. I've been once and of course it was very different back then, but on the whole I just don't find it that interesting compared to a city like Paris or Florence, and that is a personal bias, not an actual flaw with the game, but in terms of the actual game, I'd say it's not too bad. It looks really nice, you'll get some really nice lighting and reflections. There's this workhouse that looks stunning with all these furnaces in the wall, but most importantly, it's actually alive. If you slow down and walk amongst the people, you'll see them actually doing things instead of just walking about. Even if it's something as small as a lad kicking a football up a wall, that's really good. Seeing people dancing, working, putting up posters, playing cricket, these are good and are what make a world feel like its inhabitants are actually living as opposed to just existing as they often do in a lot of games. With that said though, I think the setting is too close to the modern day and there's liberties taken, like guns being very downplayed. The guards shoot at you like they would in AC3, despite the fact that they have semi-automatic weapons far more efficient than a musket, as well as revolvers. Just the fact that you can use a 6-shooter in Assassin's Creed feels really out of place, as well as the general weapons not being very fitting of the series, and it's yet another thing that makes the game feel as if it doesn't belong here. I don't really remember any kind of ambient music in Syndicate, which is kind of annoying as that really fleshes out the personality of a certain place, but the soundtrack wasn't that great to start and can get a bit grating at times, so it could have been nice for some quiet. On the whole though, my issue with the game's world comes more in its traversal, and its contents are fairly decent. Side content is yet another big slip up with Syndicate. You've got that Helix rift, but you know my thoughts on that already, and everything else is quite bad. The only other side missions you had were the associate missions, which are fairly standard, mediocre Ubisoft side missions that are basically the same as the main story, and that's kind of my issue, is that they don't offer any sort of relief from a very slow and boring story and just hit you with more of the same. The collectibles are even worse. You can collect flowers, beer bottles and illustrations, which has about as much to as it sounds. The main motivation for collectibles should be they have narrative significance, they're interesting in their own right, or they reward you with something, or any mix of those three. And Syndicate doesn't have any of that. I think the only one with backstory is the flowers, which Henry wants, as flower picking is an English tradition, which doesn't really compel me to get them, to be honest. The other two, there's nothing. I know you get a belt and a special dye for your robes, but that is really not worth the time at all. The next thing you have is Rouge's Vault, which there's a little more to, as you have to find the secrets of London to unlock this special armour hidden by an assassin, but if you take the curtain back, it's just another fetch quest with a hideous reward and some riddles to go with it. It's a spin on things, however it's quite irritating to me you can buy the map for these exclusively with Helix credits. I don't really like microtransactions giving you shortcuts after you paid for the game, and even though it's small, it's quite scummy still. Now the very last bit of side content is the gang territory, so you actually have to liberate 3 of these to finish the story, so these are quite important. Basically, you go around a specific part of London and liberate it. This can be by kidnapping a gang leader, killing every member of a gang in an area, or liberating a workhouse. And all of these involve, or in the case of kidnappings, are far more convenient if you just go to a base and kill some people. And that's repeated again and again, making use of a very repetitive combat system that's mandatory you do in between an already very repetitive story. What I'm saying here is the game is a total slog. Even when I got the game on release and I was really excited, I remember ploughing through a few sequences trying to finish the game as quickly as possible, as was tradition on the release of a new AC, and even then, at the peak of my gaming stamina, I had to just stop playing for a bit because the game really starts to grate on you as you do this same and not very fun thing over and over with no connection to the narrative or the characters or any of this. This is why the side content had to be good, to at least break that up a bit, but instead it's either more of the same or totally mindless. There is an ungodly amount of gang bases to deal with, and I feel this would have been far better if instead of just switching off your mind for an hour or two and liberating the 50th workhouse just for it to climax in yet another battle like the ones you've been doing for the last hour, I think we should have got to know the gang leaders a bit more. If these were like Templar hunts where we do a few missions in each territory, working up to killing one of the leaders, each with something of a personality or something that defined them, then when you killed them you could maybe get a benefit or perk for having taken over that area instead of just feeding you more money for a dead economy. So before I close this off, I thought I'd add some side notes that really didn't fit anywhere. First of all, the insertion of historical figures is dreadful.
Phonetic telegraph? Sounds a bit of a mouthful. You could just call it a telephone.
It feels patronising to have a very recognisable historical figure come up to you, say or do something very stereotypical of them, tell you their name, and then also have a bit of text that comes up that says their name. And, you know, I appreciate Ubisoft catering to the lobotomised among us, however I didn't know who these were because I can't read, so maybe if they just gave us any more sort of hints, that'd be nice. It's like I'm watching Horrible Histories, except that's genuinely funny when it tries to be and treats its audience more maturely than this 18 rated game. They never go beyond what you'd expect of these figures despite being a huge part of the game and all, when we could have had actually meaningful side characters or even developed the main ones for a start, instead of taking time out the game to show you how quirky and out there Karl Marx was. Also, the two boss battles in this game are quite horrendous. There's one in sequence 6, I think, with Lucy Thorne, which is portrayed as this epic huge moment that's incredibly anticlimactic in practice given the goofy combat, as well as these weird quick time events that were reused in the final boss battle against Starrick, which is even more anticlimactic as you'll go up and hit him a few times, then after probably less than 10 seconds you'll do it again as the other character until he's dead. Jacob also doesn't wear robes, instead having a coat, and you can't get him to wear proper robes, just longer coats. Evie's robes aren't too bad, I'm just not a fan of them in black and I always change to this, and the fact hoods are down unless you crouch is ridiculously stupid and again feels condescending, as if we needed the hood to be able to tell we were meant to be being secretive. And the same thing goes for the fact that you can't just jump off roofs and you actually have to try far too hard to be able to drop off things. Another side note is the glitches were fairly common. You'd often grab a ledge that wasn't there that could ruin your flow of movement. I had a few weird ragdoll moments. There's also this glitch when the break defense bar just doesn't show for some reason. And also, oh, Henry, do you need a hand there? You okay? I mean, at least you didn't willfully tie yourself up in a Templar base this time. On a serious note though, these glitches, they're not on a Unity level where you'd have to restart the game at times, but the glitches are very noticeable and there is far too many for a AAA game. I've touched on it earlier, but also the tone is terribly done. It's trying to have a story with themes of oppression, yet the actual dialogue and characters don't fit that at all. When Jacob is trying to make a joke of anything, and the next second you're expected to be devastated or feel some kind of genuine emotion, and with that kind of delivery on top of the story and a melancholic setting, you just end up with tonal whiplash really, from beginning to end. I'd have loved to have had some big closing monologue here, but I'm stuck. Assassin's Creed Syndicate is a remarkably unremarkable game, and if I had to give it a number it'd be a mid to strong 3, and the way I see it is a series of symptoms that would become more prominent in Quebec's next project. Things like neglecting the IP by shafting the modern day and ruining traversal, as well as smaller things like Jacob not wearing proper robes and hoods only going up in stealth, the time period being too close to the modern day, the combat not fitting the series, all symptoms that will go on to form a malformed beast some years later, something so horrible and wretched that people would look back on this disaster and say, it's not that bad. A game that strayed so far from the series, even further than this, to the point it was on the brink of death and collapse. But you know what? I'm not a total masochist. I do value my mental well-being to some extent, so we won't talk about that today. I hope you enjoyed this. This will have took a while to make, probably 3 or 4 days, you know, between uploads, but I hope it was worth it. I'm hoping to do Origins next and then Brotherhood for the decade anniversary. But yeah, If you did enjoy this, maybe leave a like. I really appreciate that and the support on these longer projects if you do enjoy them. I'll say it again because it is the internet, all of this is my opinion. As harsh as it might have seemed, I didn't want to have to keep saying that again and again. This is only this negative as it's my second least favourite in the series, and every game not by Quebec, there's considerably more stuff I can compliment even if I don't love the game. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, maybe leave a like, and if you didn't, maybe let me know why. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.